This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 194 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know a lot of you have seen your trade deadline pass, but this podcast is still going to feature buys and sells for the next couple of weeks because they still matter to a degree. Though you may not be able to actually buy and sell players, you can use the language to help determine how confident you should feel about a player. So when you hear buy player X, know that it also can mean feel pretty confident that player X is going to perform better than expectation down the stretch. I just wanted to throw that out there before we look at this week's transactions. I also wanted to let you guys know that the NumberFire Podcast Network is going to continue the free roll that we've been running each week over on FanDuel for all NumberFire Podcast Network listeners. Tune into this week's podcasts to get the link, and when you enter, you've got a chance to win FanDuel points and NumberFire premium subscriptions. Add Austin Ekeler and Justin Jackson. So with Melvin Gordon now out, Austin Ekeler becomes the running back that you want in Los Angeles. In Week 12, he played about 36% of the team's snaps, which was second most at running back behind only Melvin Gordon. He only carried the ball 5 times, but he was targeted 11 times through the air. That's by far a season high. And when Gordon missed time earlier this season, remember back in Week 7, he didn't play against the Titans, Austin Ekeler had 12 rushing attempts while seeing 7 targets in that game while playing over 95% of the team's snaps. So Austin Ekeler is the running back that you want in that backfield with Melvin Gordon sidelined. But don't forget about Justin Jackson either. He had a really strong college production profile. My model actually didn't mind Justin Jackson at all, and on Sunday, he ran the ball 7 times for 57 yards. Not only could he see a little bit of work with Gordon not in the lineup, but he becomes somewhat of a handcuff to Ekeler over these next few weeks. And speaking of handcuffs, you guys, while you know that I'm not a big proponent of drafting them, I most definitely am someone who adds handcuffs as the season goes on. I've talked about that many times on this podcast. So if players like Spencer Ware, Malcolm Brown, or maybe even someone like Wayne Gallman are on your waiver wire, add them. Get them on your roster now. Buy Antonio Brown. After a big Juju Smith-Schuster performance in Week 12, a lot of fantasy managers might be a little bit down on Antonio Brown. And that's especially true if you compare how AB is performing versus how we expected him to perform at the beginning of the season. But not only was he still okay in Pittsburgh's game against Denver on Sunday, he still had 9 catches on 13 targets, but he's still seeing plenty of volume in that Steelers offense. On the year, he has a 25.6% target share. It's one of the better marks that you're going to find in football. And considering Pittsburgh's thrown the ball more than any other team in the league, that target share actually creates even more volume than it would on most other teams. And as I've been saying for weeks now, the Steelers have an awesome fantasy football playoff schedule. They get Oakland in Week 14, then New England in Pittsburgh, and then New Orleans in the Superdome. Those are all 3+ matchups when you consider how many points Pittsburgh could score in those games. So if you have Antonio Brown, feel good about having Antonio Brown. Do not sweat this big Juju Smith-Schuster game. Although to be clear, Juju Smith-Schuster is a monster. Add Rex Burkhead. You guys remember Rex Burkhead? Well, he's eligible to come back and play in Week 13. And he's been practicing and he appears to be healthy. Now, I don't know how that's going to translate to the stat sheet. I don't know exactly how it's going to impact James White and Sony Michel. But Burkhead is certainly worth a flyer off the waiver wire. He could end up getting more work than we expect, but also he sort of serves as a handcuff in that New England offense. If something happens to James White or Sony Michel, Rex Burkhead is going to emerge and be viable. So he is sort of a dart throw type ad, but I think that it's worth it given this time of year and the offense that he plays in. Sell Kenyon Drake. Kenyon Drake has to be one of the most unpredictable fantasy assets. He's now given fantasy footballers a weekly top 12 performance 5 different times, but he's also finished outside of the top 35 different times. And the thing is, Drake isn't seeing drastically different snap rates in these games where he's blown up. In his 5 good performances, he's been on the field for about 58% of Miami's snaps. In his 5 bad ones, that number is about 56%. And his game against Indianapolis on Sunday was a little bit matchup driven as well. The Colts actually entered the week as the top team in percentage of receiving yards allowed to wide receivers, meaning they've given up the fewest percentage of receiving yards to the wide receiver position in the NFL. And entering the week, they gave up 21% of their receiving yards to running backs. It's one of the highest rates in the league. And Drake did most of his work fantasy-wise through the air, catching 5 of 6 targets for 64 yards and a touchdown. The thing is, it's not that he can't produce moving forward. I actually still expect Kenyon Drake to have a couple of strong games from here on out. The main issue is predicting when those performances are going to happen, and then hoping that he's going to find the end zone within a pretty bad offense. And with Frank Gore still very much a big part of this offense, Kenyon Drake is not the easiest back to rely on through the month of December. By DJ Moore. Moore has now played 3/4 of Carolina's snaps in each of the team's last 4 games. And during this time, he's been on the receiving end of nearly 20% of Cam Newton's attempts, and he's scored 28.7 and 17.8 PPR points over the last 2 games. This is huge for fantasy football, because in Week 13, the Panthers will take on the Buccaneers. We know that's a plus matchup. And then they're going to face the Browns, Saints, and Falcons in the fantasy football playoffs. The Saints and Falcons specifically are allowing the most and the third most points to the wide receiver position this year in fantasy football. So I think DJ Moore is here to stay, and if you have him, feel good that you have him. Add Curtis Samuel. So Curtis Samuel started playing more meaningful snaps around week 7 or so. That's where his snap rate jumped to the 30% range. But with Devin Funchess sidelined on Sunday, Samuel was on the field for 91.5% of the Panthers' snaps. He only saw 2 targets, but he did find the end zone for the 3rd time in 4 games. So if Devin Funchess misses more time, Curtis Samuel should have some flex appeal down the stretch while playing in those aforementioned favorable matchups. And even if Devin Funchess returns, I think Curtis Samuel has done enough to warrant more playing time. Add Nyheim Hines. So Marlon Mack exited the Colts Week 12 game with a concussion, and that led to a 37% snap share for my boy Nyheim Hines. That's his highest total since Week 6. And that was the game before Mack's return from injury earlier in the season. A full week off may allow Marlon Mack to get through the concussion protocol. But if he doesn't, Hines is most definitely an interesting option off the waiver wire, considering he ran the ball 9 times in Sunday's contest when teammate Jordan Wilkins didn't have a single rush. And don't forget, guys, without Marlon Mack this year, Nyheim Hines averaged over 16.5 PPR points per game. So he's worth an add this week just in case Mack isn't able to go. Add Bruce Ellington. Ellington now has 16 targets over Detroit's last 2 games, and he saw a snap rate increase from 50.8% in Week 11 to 81.8% in Week 12. According to Pro Football Focus, during this time, he's played 45.8% of his snaps from the slot, which leads the Lions. He hasn't totally been the Golden Tate replacement in the Lions offense, but things are definitely trending in the right direction for Bruce Ellington. And with Marvin Jones now on IR, Ellington is absolutely a strong add off the waiver wire for wide receiver needy teams. Sell Jarvis Landry. It wasn't like Jarvis Landry was going nuts with Todd Haley as offensive coordinator, but he was seeing some crazy volume. He was averaging 11.6 targets per game and a 30.6% target share with Todd Haley. That at least gave him a more predictable floor week in and week out in fantasy football. But in 3 games with Freddie Kitchens as the offensive coordinator, Landry's had 5.7 targets per game and a 19.3% target share. That's drastically different than what we saw with Landry and Todd Haley. And that's alarming. And it's definitely a big deal when you factor in the matchups. The Browns have faced the Chiefs, Falcons, and Bengals over these 3 games. It's hard to find 3 better matchups. So even in these plus matchups, Landry really hasn't been effective with Kitchens as OC. And that's really, really hard to rely on down the stretch. Hold Courtland Sutton. So Courtland Sutton has not been usable in fantasy without Demaryius Thomas in this Broncos lineup. That's been a little bit surprising, but remember, he's a rookie. Growing pains happen. But it has forced a lot of fantasy managers to question if they should just flat out drop Courtland Sutton. And I think it's a little bit premature to do so, because Denver does have a nice rest of season schedule going up against Cincy, San Francisco, Cleveland, and Oakland through week 16. So even if Courtland Sutton is just bench depth, the upside is still there. Add Ryan Switzer. So according to Pro Football Focus, through week 11, so prior to this last week's game, Juju Smith-Schuster had played 76.2% of his snaps from the slot. Ryan Switzer's rate was 74.4%, but he'd never been a full-time player. He had failed to hit a 30% snap share in all but 2 games heading into week 12. But then on Sunday, things looked a lot different. Smith-Schuster ran only 24% of his routes from the slot, while Switzer was lined up there on almost 85% of his snaps. And all the while, Switzer's snap rate jumped to 66.7%, which was by far a season high. Now, this could have easily been the Steelers just finding a better matchup for Juju and shifting him away from slot corner Chris Harris. In fact, I think that's actually what happened, But on the off chance that they're actually looking to utilize Switzer more in this offense, because after all, his snap rate was rising prior to this Week 12 game, if they are trying to utilize him a little bit more, then he's worth a look in deeper formats. And that's especially true because Vance McDonald missed part of this game with a hip injury. He left the game, and that could open up more opportunities in the middle portion of the field. Add Jesse James. So I'll be quick with this. I just mentioned that Vance McDonald has a hip injury, and he left that Week 12 game against Denver with that injury. And if he misses time, then Jesse James becomes an interesting option at the awful tight end position. In Week 12, James ranked in the top 10 in routes run at tight end, and he saw 4 targets. And with a favorable passing game schedule ahead for Pittsburgh, he's not a bad look if your squad does need help at the tight end position. Add Case Keenum. So fair warning, the quarterback streaming options this week and moving forward are very, very rough. And the main reason for that is because there are a ton of quarterbacks who are rostered in that 40% to 50% range, which pushes them out of streaming territory. So as we approach the end of the season, be prepared to hear me talk about guys like Case Keenum. But hopefully you don't have an issue at quarterback because there are like 20 of them who are start-worthy in any given week. But let's go back to Case Keenum. The Broncos are on the road this week. That's not good. But they're going up against a Bengals defense that has been terrible this season. They've allowed nearly 300 more yards than any other group in football. And no team is allowing more fantasy points per game to quarterbacks than the Bengals are. So that bodes well for Keenum, who's actually given fantasy managers 15 plus fantasy points in 6 of his games played this season. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. So Miami's a 6.5 point favorite against Buffalo this week with a low game total, and that makes them a strong streaming option. Though the Bills do have more upside and they look more explosive with Josh Allen under center, they've still allowed an average of 3.6 sacks and 1 interception per game to opposing defenses when Josh Allen gets the start. Miami is out there in 90% of Yahoo leagues, which makes them a very obvious standard streaming option here in Week 13. Add or hold the Buffalo Bills defense. The Bills aren't a bad play in Week 13 either, but the real reason they're on this week's list is because in Week 14, the standard first week of the fantasy football playoffs, they'll face the Jets in Buffalo. New York has now allowed a top 10 defensive performance against them in 4 of their last 5 games, and they've averaged just 11.3 points per game on the road since their crazy Week 1 performance against the Lions. So if you were planning on getting rid of that Buffalo defense, one that I actually recommended last week on this podcast, just hold tight. Keep the Bills defense. They should be good for at least the next couple of weeks. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column on numberfire.com is to add Equanimous St. Brown. Randall Cobb just keeps not playing, and that's allowed St. Brown to play a more significant role in the slot for the Packers. He played about 74% of his snaps from that area of the field on Sunday night according to Pro Football Focus, and he saw 5 targets, which was a season high. And here's a quick 17th transaction for you guys. Go and see if Adam Humphries and Chris Godwin are on your waiver wire. They should both be rostered regardless, but Deshaun Jackson is seeing a hand specialist this week, so maybe there's a chance that he misses time. And if he does, both Godwin and Humphries should see a nice bump. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to everyone for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spotify. And if you're on iTunes, please leave me a rating and review. I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.